Hey, this is Torrin Walker. If you like Context Media Group, help us to keep telling stories. Hello and welcome to Wednesday Wisdom. This is Torrin Walker, and today my guest is Ryan Knight. Ryan is a political activist. He's the host of Amped Up podcast. He's also an advisory board member for the Movement for People's Party. So Ryan, how are you doing this morning?
Hey, good morning, Torrin. Thank you for having me on your show.
Thank you, man. I just want to get right into it. You were active in the liberal resistance that grew up around the election of Donald Trump, and you progressed from that to declaring yourself a socialist. Can you take people through the political journey that got you to this point?
Absolutely. And I think that's a common question because it's pretty rare, I think, nowadays. It seems like most Americans, they form their political, basis by the time they're in their early 20s, and they think, okay, I'm either a Democrat or I'm a Republican, and those are the only two options, right? And for me, I've always been a lifelong Democrat. I was a Democrat for 18 years. Until finally, around, right after the election of Donald Trump, I got really involved with a lot of Democratic establishment institutions and groups, to kind of spearhead the resistance. And, but what ended up waking me up was realizing that a lot of these groups that say they're for the people, and a lot of these more corporate establishment Democrats, they'll go on CNN and they talk a great game. Look, if the rhetoric of some of these establishment Democrats, if the policies they were actually fighting for matched their rhetoric, we'd be in a much better space in this country. But what ended up happening, or what I ended up waking up to, it's like, these more establishment Democrats will go on CNN and they'll tell the American people when the cameras are rolling that healthcare is a human right. And then when the cameras turn off, they actually won't fight for the policy, Medicare for all, to make healthcare a human right. Or they'll say climate change is real. But they won't actually fight for the policy, a Green New Deal, to do something about climate change. And they do the same thing, that they'll say Black Lives Matter, but they won't actually fight to defund the police and shift resources into Black and brown communities, or to fight for reparations and, and actual policies that will improve people's material conditions. And so when I started to kind of wake up and see that a lot of what the Democratic Party was spouting were just platitudes, and that this moment in history demands a lot more than just platitudes, right? When there are this many Americans who are suffering, we actually need policies that will improve their lives, especially communities who the status quo in Washington and business as usual in Washington has historically always failed. And so when I realized that, the majority of the Democrats were essentially just, very similar to Republicans, governing for their corporate donors, but just feeding the people nice platitudes, I realized that we need to do more than that. And I realized that if I wanted to kind of if I wanted to back up like what I was saying, then I actually had to walk the walk and not just talk the talk like these corporate Democrats do. And so that's when I started getting involved with the left movement. I supported Bernie's campaign. I started backing truly progressive Democrats like Cori Bush and Jamal Bowman and AOC and the Squad. And then I realized that the inside strategy to kind of try to change the system from within, that's kind of hard when there's only 10 true progressives in Congress. And the rest are corporate Democrats who say things like, well, we need party unity, but what I've learned is party unity doesn't mean a damn thing if Democrats are just going to be united behind their corporate donors, right? We need Democrats to be united behind policies that will save people's lives, like Medicare for all and a Green New Deal and universal basic income and even something like reparations. And so that's what we need to unify behind. We need to unify behind a for the people agenda. So my transformation was really just understanding how corrupt our political system is, how even the Democrats who I thought were the good guys, turns out they're just playing the same corrupt, big money, corporate power game that the Republicans are playing. They just dress it up a little bit better and, use a lot of nice fancy words, but then don't ever back up those words and fight for marginalized communities and the poor and the working class. And if we want to see justice in this country, we all have to start rising up for justice and fighting for justice. And that means more than just platitudes. That means actually supporting policies that will improve people's lives.
Okay. The American political system is framed as a binary system, Republicans versus Democrats,
Yep.
red versus blue, left versus right. The 2020 election cycle revealed a new binary, liberals versus progressives.
Mm.
For people who may think they're the same thing, can you go into what's the difference between a liberal and a progressive?
Absolutely. I would say that a liberal is someone who is comfortable with the status quo, and someone who, Trump's language, was maybe very offensive to them. But let's be clear, the policies that Trump implemented are pretty much the same policies that every corporatist president has implemented in the past 4 decades, right? So the endless wars continued. The economic inequality crisis in our country continued. The racial injustice crisis continued. And yeah, Trump used very derogatory language that made it even worse and amplified it. But if you just it was like the only thing liberals were really offended by was his language. Because if you look at, how the Democrats governed during the Trump administration, Nancy Pelosi and House Democrats, they voted for a lot of his authoritarian legislation. They voted for the Patriot Act, which is mass surveillance. They voted for militarized policing. They voted for these for Trump's bloated military budget. And so again, while they say that they oppose Trump and they resisted Trump, but are you really resisting Trump when you are voting for his authoritarian programs? Are you really resisting Trump if you're funding his fascist programs? And so a liberal is someone who's just, they just think that, okay, if we just get rid of these corporate-backed Republicans and replace them with blue corporate-backed Democrats, that's somehow going to heal the wounds of this nation, when if you just sit back and realize, like, they're both bought and paid for by corporations, both parties. And so just replacing a corporate Republican with a corporate Democrat isn't going to give us the substantive change that we need. A leftist or a progressive is someone who's not just looking at things from okay, this is red versus blue. Progressives are looking at things like policies that will actually improve people's lives, right? Policies like I touched on earlier, like Medicare for all and universal basic income, and even like reparations. And so progressives are about healing the injustice and inequality in this nation through fighting for bold policies, whereas liberals are just more content with, okay, let's get rid of Trump and get rid of these corporate Republicans, but then let's just go back to business as usual, right? Back to 2016. And I think that what's dangerous right now about liberals is, and what liberals aren't understanding, is just going back to 2016 when this many Americans are struggling isn't good enough. And also the conditions and where America was in 2016 were the exact conditions that made people desperate enough to vote for a con man like Trump. So in many ways, when we just allow these two corporate parties to rule us, we've kind of in America been stuck in this vicious cycle where every 4 to 8 years we go back and forth from, this kind of corporate neoliberal extremism to this kind of far-right fascism. And neither of those ideologies and neither of those ways of governing will actually improve the lives of the people. That kind of governance only improves the lives of only improves corporations and billionaires and Americans who are comfortable with the status quo. And so when the status quo is failing this many people, we need a lot more than just this kind of, this liberalism that wants to just govern like business as usual. We need true progressives who actually, want to govern for the people and not their corporate donors. So that to me is like one of the really big differences. I say if you could sum it up in a few sentences, it's like liberals want to maintain the status quo, and progressives want to fight and change these corrupt systems. So we can fight back against some of this this systemic injustice and inequality in this country.
Okay. You've been very outspoken on social media and also in your work about calling out what you feel is the domination of the Democratic National Committee and the Democratic Party by moderates and centrists, and how they marginalize the progressive left. Why do you think they've been so adamant about fighting against their left wing, and why do you think that how that had happened in the first place?
So, I mean, and this is a great question, but it's very simple. Like, the reason that the DNC doesn't like the progressive movement is because we are a threat to their corporate donors. right? The reason the Democratic Party doesn't support, or the DNC and Democratic establishment politicians don't support Medicare for all, it's because the party is bought and paid for by the giant insurance companies and big pharma, right? The reason the DNC doesn't want a Green New Deal is because it's bought and paid for by the big oil companies. The reason the DNC doesn't want to end these endless wars is because, you know, just like the Republican Party, they're bought and paid for by the defense industry and by the military-industrial complex. And so when you unpack our political system, you see that big money and these giant corporations and the billionaire class, they control Washington, and they have essentially bought in both parties in Washington. And so when both parties are bought and paid for by these corporations and billionaires, it really doesn't matter who wins the election, because whichever corporate party wins, they're going to represent, you know, their corporate donors. And so that's the reason that the DNC didn't like Bernie Sanders and doesn't like the progressive movement, because we are a threat to their corporate donors and to the status quo in Washington. And I think that, you know, one of the things I think they're really good at doing, though, again, is kind of co-opting the language of the progressive movement because they want our votes without actually supporting the policies that will improve people's lives. And so we're kind of in this tug of war right now, where the DNC wants to keep, you know, maintain the status quo in Washington, and the progressive movement is loudly and proudly saying that when the status quo is killing the poor and the working class and Black and brown communities and our planet, that the status quo isn't good enough. And people are rising up and demanding better from the Democratic Party. And you know what? That's what, if we want to live in a democracy, that's what democracy is all about. You know, democracy isn't about worshiping politicians and putting these people up on pedestals. Democracy is about challenging our leaders and about demanding better, and about questioning those in authority, especially when those in authority are allowing so many people to suffer. You know, just look at this pandemic. You know, we have 50 million people who are going hungry. We have 40 million people facing eviction. And our government won't even provide an adequate bailout for the people. But we know they provided an adequate bailout for their corporate donors in the billionaire class. And back in March, when this pandemic first struck, and the consequences have been staggering. You know, we've seen the billionaire class increase their wealth by over $1 trillion, while, you know, the rest of us are barely keeping our heads above water. And so, you know, the system that we have right now is just not right. It's just not fair. And people feel that. And I think that's what the progressive movement is doing right now. We're fighting for dignity and justice for all people. It's not an extreme agenda. It's not a radical agenda. You know, and I think this is an important distinction, because I am so tired of leftism and socialism being painted as extreme. You know, wanting everyone in this country to have healthcare is not extreme. You know, wanting every worker in this country to be paid a living wage is not extreme. You know, making amends and righting this nation's wrongs and atrocities that have been committed against Black people and supporting reparations, that's not extreme. What is extreme is a predatory capitalist system that has now resulted in just 3 billionaires now hoard more wealth than half of our entire nation. You know, what is extreme are these corporatist politicians in both parties who continue to support these endless wars, you know, that we've been in since 2001 and even before that. You know, that's what's extreme. What's extreme is allowing these big oil companies to continue to destroy our planet and amplify the climate crisis. And so we've got to get away from these people on TV and these paid political pundits on CNN who are always trying to define justice and dignity for all people as somehow being extreme. You know, there's nothing extreme about the progressive movement. The progressive movement is about righteousness. It's about dignity. It's about justice. And so as we continue to fight together and we continue to seek solidarity across the movement, you know, I want to see our country build solidarity amongst the working class and amongst, you know, Black, brown, and white people who are just tired of the injustice and tired of a system that has robbed so much from them and continues to concentrate so much wealth in the hands of so few at the top.
Well, let me ask you about that. how much do you think that the mainstream media has been a party to this? Because there's been a lot of conversation now about suddenly the mainstream media is starting to rebel against Trump, but nobody's really talking about the fact that a large reason why Trump got as far as he was because he was getting free advertising dollars by constantly being on mainstream media and on cable news constantly for almost 2 years up until the election. How complicit are they in what's going on?
The media is complicit on everything, and I would go so far as to say that the mainstream media in America is the biggest barrier to progressive change in America. Let's remember that these media companies are Fortune 500 companies, so they have a vested interest in maintaining the status quo themselves, right? They don't want to pay their fair share in taxes. You know, they don't want to have to pay all their workers a living wage. They don't want to pay for all their employees to have health care. And so we've seen, we saw in this Democratic primary how, the corporate media how they would treat candidates like Pete Buttigieg or Amy Klobuchar or Joe Biden, who weren't peddling any, progressive change. They were basically just, spouting platitudes and, fighting to maintain the status quo. And the corporate media and all their pundits, constantly would frame those candidates and paint those candidates as decent and compassionate, even though they weren't fighting for the change that the people need. Now, if you watch how they covered candidates like Bernie Sanders or Julian Castro or, any candidate that's actually fighting for real change for the people, they would always, label those candidates as divisive, and so the corporate media, their entire purpose is to maintain the status quo in Washington. And you see also some of the pundits they pick, MSNBC is now full of never Trump Republicans. You know what I mean? Like and yes, you're absolutely right. When Trump, when he ran for office, they gave him so much free media. And what's really interesting to me, and they did it even in this cycle again, is watch how the corporate media covers the Democratic primary. They will always favor the most moderate candidate, like for instance, Joe Biden. And even in 2016, the way they covered that race, they favored Hillary Clinton, the more moderate candidate in the primary, over Bernie. But then when you get into the general, right, then the corporate media didn't give favorable news coverage to Hillary Clinton or Joe Biden. They always give favorable news coverage to the conservative who is going to maintain the status quo even more than the moderate Democrat. And so we see the favoritism play out time and time again, and we see Democrats fall for it. And this is why for the last 50 years, we've seen corporations just get richer and richer, and the billionaire class just get richer and richer, while the working class and marginalized communities are falling further and further behind, because our corporate media is complicit in maintaining the status quo in Washington. The other thing I would add is, how often do you turn on CNN or MSNBC and hear them talking about real issues that affect the lives of everyday people? How often do you hear them talking about policy? Very little. When I turn on CNN, it'll be a pundit being like, oh my gosh, Speaker Pelosi, did you see she ripped up Trump's speech? Or it'll be like, oh man, did you hear what Trump tweeted today? It's always these kind of superficial issues that don't impact the lives of everyday people in marginalized communities. And so we need real people on CNN and MSNBC, people like you, Torin, who are actually fighting for policies and fighting for the Black community and fighting for the poor and the working class. Because right now, I feel like we just have a bunch of mouthpieces for the establishment. And that's the last thing we need when there's this much inequality and this much injustice. We don't need people parroting talking points on the corporate media. We need real journalism that's actually going to uncover how many Americans are suffering. Why are Americans suffering like this? Why in this country, the supposed richest nation on earth, are there 140 million Americans who are poor or low income? Why, are there 92 million Americans who are either underinsured or uninsured? And it's because of our corrupt system and our corrupt politicians who are in bed with these corporations and billionaires, and who continue to pass laws that favor the ruling class and are rigged against the working class and everyday people.
All right. The Trump administration has been called one of the most incompetent and cronyist in American history. It's also been extremely dangerous to the American public due to the mistreatment of detainees in ICE camps, the rolling back of civil rights protections, and massive ethics violations. Now that the Trump administration is coming to an end, the tone of the Democratic establishment seems to be one of reconciliation. If the Trump regime is so bad, why is moving on the focus instead of correction and holding them accountable?
Because this is how they maintain the status quo in Washington. You know, what these corporate Democrats don't want the American public to realize is that, you know, while Trump put the kids in cages, guess who built those cages? Barack Obama and Joe Biden built those cages at the border, right? What the corporate Democrats don't want you to realize is after the financial crash in 2008, you know, and Barack Obama becomes president, you know, Barack Obama, here's the thing about Barack Obama. He campaigned very progressively. That's how he won. You know, when you watched Obama campaign, he wasn't talking about, you know, maintaining the status quo in Washington. He wasn't talking about business as usual. He was talking about hope and change. You know, he was talking about universal health care. He ran very progressive. Now, when he got into power, he turned around then and governed like a corporatist and governed for Wall Street, giant corporations, and the billionaire class. He would just sedate the public with these platitudes of hope and change. And so it was confusing, right? Because then the financial crash happens and the government does what it does best. It bailed out its corporate donors, just like it did during this pandemic. And we saw 11 million Americans lose their homes under the Obama administration. So again, although I supported Obama, I voted for him twice, you know, I loved Obama until I kind of woke up and saw that, like, Obama's rhetoric, you know, it never matched what he was actually fighting for when he got into office. It didn't match the policies. And so the reason these Democrats now just want to kind of, you know, let everyone on the Republican Party off is because they both work for the same donors. You know, the Democratic Party has, like I said earlier, they have a vested interest in the status quo in Washington. They know that if they fight for real change, that their corporate donors will be unhappy with that. So what they're going to try to do is they're going to try to call for, their favorite word is bipartisanship, you know, or reaching across the aisle to work with Republicans. Now, I just want people to understand, when you have a party like the Republican Party that is a fascist party, and you have the Democratic Party, which is like a corporatist party, when a corporatist party and a fascist party meet in the middle and they compromise on legislation, you're never going to get legislation that favors everyday people. You're going to get legislation that favors corporations and billionaires. And so that's really the problem, is meeting in the middle when both parties work for corporations is just giving corporations more power. That is why it's so important for us to continue building, continue to electing progressives who don't take corporate PAC money, and who, when the corporate lobbyists knock on a progressive's door in Washington, the progressives aren't obligated to meet with the corporate lobbyists because they didn't take corporate money to get into power, you know, like the establishment Democrats did. So it's a lot easier if your donors are $3, $4, $5 donations from everyday people to go into Washington and then work for everyday people than it is for these establishment Democrats who've literally got into power by taking corporate PAC money. And so that's why there's just this, you know, people like Chris Coons and Joe Biden and Nancy Pelosi and every corporate Democrat in Congress, they love reaching across the aisle, because when they work with Republicans, they're also working for their corporate donors, and they're not working for the people. And so that is why we have to continue to hold them accountable, even if they have a D in front of their name. That doesn't mean anything. And I would just, you know, everything I'm saying today, like, all you have to do is go to opensecrets.org or go to and look up the FEC filings, and you can see that these Democrats, you know, they take about just as much money from giant corporations in Wall Street as Republicans do. In fact, in 2020, Wall Street gave more money to Joe Biden and Democrats than it did to Trump and Republicans. So again, that's what's happening in Washington. The government is not working for the people. The government is working for the powerful, working for big banks, working for the military-industrial complex, and for Wall Street. And until we fix that problem, until we hold our both of these corporate parties accountable and all of our politicians accountable to truly do what they took an oath to do, which is to represent the American people, nothing will fundamentally change in Washington. And it's painful for me to say that, but that's just the uncomfortable truth.
Okay. The 2020 election cycle has seen young voters, especially young African-American voters in particular, demanding tangible policy in exchange for voting Democrat. These demands have been met with pandering at best and condescension and insults at worst. We just had the leak from the conversation that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris had with civil rights leaders. Why would establishment Democrats respond this way to their quote unquote strongest and most solid voting bloc?
The first thing I want to say is I am so unbelievably proud of the Black Lives Matter movement, and all of and the protests that we had this year against racial injustice in this country. It was long overdue, and what really breaks my heart about what the Democratic establishment is doing is the reason Joe Biden and Kamala won is we saw a spike in voter registration in cities like Atlanta, and cities like Detroit, Michigan, that were determinative in giving Joe Biden the Electoral College. You know, Georgia and Michigan were if Biden doesn't win those, he's not going to win the Electoral College. And so these Black Lives Matter protests actually helped Joe Biden win and beat Donald Trump. So right after hearing them, condemn, activist slogans like defund the police, and that is, they're not listening to the communities on the ground. They are not listening to these brave activists who are demanding policies in return for their votes. That is how we make America better, by these Black and brown activists rising up and demanding something for their vote. And the reason that the Democratic establishment has such disdain for them is like what I said earlier. They don't want to work for the people. They want to continue to work for their corporate donors and just sedate us with these platitudes of hope and change. And it's going to take a lot more of us coming together and continuing to be brave and continuing to demand actual policies. And so everything that the activists that you're talking about are doing, they're on the side of justice. And these corporate Democrats and Joe Biden are not. And if we're going to get Joe Biden and corporate Democrats on the side of justice, we have got to continue to make these demands and to be unapologetic in our fights. And, when there are this many Americans who are struggling and struggling, and it's the people who at the margins, the poor, the working class and Black and brown communities who all of this, what's happening in Washington and these politicians who want to maintain the status quo, it hits the people at the margins the hardest. And so we can't afford, to play these games of just accepting the status quo and falling into this trap of like going back to normal. Going back to normal means that millions of Americans will continue to struggle. Forget about normal. We need to fight for a better world. And so, that's kind of my feelings on it, that even, the Democratic Party will say over and over again that Black people are the backbone of the party. Mm-hmm. But the moment Black people start demanding actual policies for their votes and start demanding justice and start demanding reparations is the moment that the Democratic Party will throw the Black community under the bus. Or people like Nina Turner, they'll say Black women are the backbone of the party, right up until the moment someone like Nina Turner comes along and demands actual justice and dignity for all people through policies. Then they'll start saying the most heinous things ever to Nina Turner. And so it's this hypocrisy where the Democrats care more about Black votes than they do about Black lives. They care more about poor people's votes than they do about poor people's lives. The Democratic Party cares more about the working class's votes than it cares about the working class's lives. And so we've got to hold them accountable. We can't just, at least they're not as bad as Republicans. How is America ever going to get better if we're going to continue to hand power to a party whose basically entire message is vote for us because we're not as bad as Republicans? No, at some point for this nation to get better and for us to fix all these systemic problems, we have to vote for good. We have to vote for politicians who actually, instead of blaming Republicans, they actually want to fight for policies that will put Republicans on defense. And that's one missed opportunity that we've had. All of these protests, all of our resistance to Trump, all of our fights against the Republicans for the last 4 years, you're not going to advance the ball and move this nation toward dignity and justice if you're not fighting for actual policies to deliver that dignity and justice. And so when the Democrats get defensive about socialism or they get defensive about defund the police, they're not being offensive in putting the Republicans on defense. They're allowing the Republicans to continue to spout, their white nationalist agenda and continue to spout and fight for their agenda and move our nation further right. And Democrats don't actually give the American people, and fight for the justice we need to move us back to the left. And that's really the problem. And they don't do that because they want to continue to govern for their corporate donors and just kind of, shut the rest of us who are demanding justice. They just want to shut us up. And we're now at the point where that's not going to work anymore. And we shouldn't accept this anymore from our government. We deserve so much better than this.
All right. Another feature of this election year has been a fixation on the idea of representation, appointing African Americans, women, people of color, and LGBTQ individuals to cabinet positions. Do you think there's a danger of optics and identity politics becoming a shield to hide policy decisions that reinforce the status quo?
100%. And I think, again, comes back to the crux of the issue. A diverse cabinet doesn't mean anything if it's a diverse cabinet of corporatist Wall Street puppets, big oil puppets, and basically careerists who've just maintained the status quo throughout their entire political careers. What true progress is actually fighting for and implementing policies that are going to disrupt the status quo and lift up the poor, the working class, and Black and brown communities. And so we've got to get away from, like you said, the optics and the identity politics. Look, I'm a member of the LGBTQ community. I could care less if someone appoints, a gay man in charge of the Pentagon. So what, now a gay man is dropping bombs on other countries? You know what I mean? Like, it's ridiculous. We need true justice. We need actual policies that are going to help marginalized communities. And so I think that that's really what the Democratic Party does. They want to take, a few people from marginalized communities, appoint them to positions of power, and say, look, everything's better now, without actually fighting for the policies that are going to help marginalized communities. And so we have to stop falling for this. It's not to say that representation matters. It absolutely matters to see yourself reflected in a position of power. But it matters a lot more if that person in power is not just a member of a marginalized community, but is actually going to fight for marginalized communities and actually going to fight for the poor and the working class. And so we've got to just, it comes back to, like, Joe Biden, time and time again, he basically got into the White House by saying that he was going to heal the soul of America, right? How many times did you hear Joe Biden say that on TV? He would say it over and over again. I'm going to heal the soul of this nation. Not once did liberals or anyone in the corporate media actually stop themselves and go, wait a second, Joe Biden, how are you going to heal the soul of America? That's a great platitude. Look, we need to heal this nation. This nation is very sick. But how are you going to do that? Because when you take it a step further and you look and see how much injustice and how much inequality we have in this nation, you realize that just a platitude isn't going to stop the racial injustice crisis. Platitudes aren't going to stop the economic inequality crisis or the climate crisis. We are way beyond the moment of just of corporate Democrats, going on TV and spouting platitudes. We need actual policies that are going to fix all the injustice that our corrupt system produces. And so, when you realize that, you think to yourself, like, there is no way that Joe Biden is going to heal the soul of America when he resists all the bold progressive policies that we need to heal the soul of America. When he doesn't support a single payer Medicare for all healthcare system, how is he healing the soul of America for the 92 million Americans who are underinsured or uninsured? When Joe Biden doesn't support reparations, how is he healing the soul of America for Black communities when the racial wealth gap in America today is as wide as it was back in 1968 in the Civil Rights Movement? How is Joe Biden healing the soul of this nation when he doesn't support a Green New Deal to stop the climate crisis? And so when we have to start, understanding that what a politician says when the cameras are rolling means nothing if they're not going to back that up with policies and legislation. And so that is what I would just challenge people with. Keep demanding better from these corporate Democrats, because until we do, we're just going to be in this back and forth game between two corporate parties who want to, as soon as they get power, they forget about us, they forget about the people who gave them power, and they just go in and use, you know what it really is in essence, Torrin? Both of these corporate parties are using our government to enrich themselves and enrich their corporate donors, and we the people are paying the price. And right now, when you see all the struggling that's happening, the price that we're paying, the price that the poor and the working class and Black and brown communities are paying, it's too steep. Like, it is just too much. It is just absurd that this corrupt government and these politicians are going to allow people to continue to suffer. All of the suffering we're seeing right now is a policy choice. It is a choice that these politicians and parties are making to put their corporate donors over the basic needs of the American people. And that has to stop now if we ever want to see justice in this nation.
All right. There seems to be an obsession with making electoral politics the only option for the American public to affect change. But there are many people who choose not to take part in the process, either on principle or through dissatisfaction with the choices they have. What can concerned citizens do beyond voting to affect change?
You know, there's a lot people can do there. You know, right now we're seeing a lot of mutual aid organizations pop up. There's a mutual aid organization in Chicago right now that's bringing diapers and baby formula to people. And I just, I donated $20 the other day because I know that, when our government is failing to provide relief to its people, it falls on the people to do that. And so we need to be getting involved in mutual aid organizations. We need to be getting involved in direct action and protest, especially, as soon as now that the vaccine is out, the government's just going to, this latest relief bill, they're still not even going, they're debating whether they're going to give us a one-time $600 check or a one-time $1,200 check, or maybe not give us another relief check at all. When what the people need is $2,000 monthly cash relief throughout the duration of this pandemic. So that just shows you how far away our politicians are from the justice that the people need. And so we're going to have to, as soon as the vaccine is out there, and especially when it becomes safer, we need to continue to rise up and protest and get involved with local progressive groups and Black Lives Matter groups that are actually protesting for the dignity and justice that everyone in this nation deserves. So electoral politics is one part of it. But again, when we're electing people that don't want to represent the people, we have to go in and use our power as citizens and use the First Amendment to demand justice. And we do that through protest, direct action, and continuing to fight for solidarity amongst all the people that our corrupt system is repressing. And there's other ways to building things like bringing democracy into the workplace, getting involved in unions, getting involved in your local church. I mean, there's a lot of different ways people can get involved. Right now we're seeing Black pastors that are pressuring our government for direct cash relief for the people. That's amazing. We need to see more institutions in this country, whether it's churches or even businesses. If these politicians are going to be so corrupt, we need other people in the community, and especially leaders in communities, to rise up and demand justice so people don't have to struggle like this. And the other thing I would say is the more we do this kind of work outside of the corporate party structure, the more we protest, the more we build mutual aid in our communities, the more that we're holding these corrupt parties accountable, because we're basically saying, look, if you're not going to represent us, we are going to build our own structures. We're going to build our own way to fight back against you. And that's why I also got involved in the movement for People's Party. People can get involved in that way. Finally, we're saying, I support the progressives in Congress who are fighting to change the system from within. But I realized that, when there's only 10 true progressives in Congress and everyone else is pretty much a corporatist, we need to start building infrastructure outside of the corporate parties and build a vehicle for progressive change to become reality, and build a party that doesn't take corporate PAC money and isn't going to work for corporate lobbyists. And so that's another way people can get involved and start organizing outside of the two corporate parties, because I think that's the kind of that will finally wake these two corporate parties up and realize that, like, wow, the people are, they need to hear the voices of the people louder than they're hearing the voices of their corporate donors. And right now, all these two corporate parties here are the voices of their corporate donors. And so until we fight back, it's going to be business as usual in Washington.
All right. Last question. What are your predictions for the future of progressive politics in America?
Honestly, my prediction is as much power as these two corporate parties have, they're overplaying their hand, because they're leaving people no choice. When you make people this desperate, and as we've seen over the last 40 years, economic inequality in America just keeps getting worse. The rich keep getting richer. So these corrupt politicians and these two corporate parties are leaving the people no choice but to fight back for their survival, to fight back for their own dignity, to fight back for justice. And as long as the progressive movement, my big fear with the progressive movement is because the corporate Democrats know how powerful the movement is, they're constantly trying to co-opt it. And they're constantly trying to, again, kind of co-opt the language of our movement without supporting the policies. So as long as we can keep the movement about justice for the poor, justice for the working class, justice for Black and brown communities, and we can keep demanding that justice and keep holding these corporate parties accountable, I think the future of the progressive movement is, it is bright, it is promising, it is hopeful. And I see that this is the only way that we are ever going to have dignity and justice in this nation. So I think, there's always internal squabbles. Right now, we're seeing a little bit of back and forth in the progressive movement over whether we should hold progressives in Congress accountable, progressives like AOC and the Squad, who I support. But, there are people in the movement now who are saying, look, you became elected because on policies like Medicare for all. So now we need you to hold Nancy Pelosi's feet to the fire, and we need you to hold these corporate Democrats' feet to the fire and actually demand a policy like Medicare for all that 70% of Americans support, that you're going to bring that policy to a floor vote, or you are going to hold these corporate Democrats accountable who are standing in the way of justice. And that, kind of accountability, even on the progressives in Congress, makes a lot of people afraid. And I get that. But we just have, at the end of the day, we have to remember, like, who are you fighting for? Whose side are you on? Are you on the side of the status quo and of this corrupt system, which keeps, putting more and more money into the pockets of the billionaire class and into the pockets of these giant corporations? Or are you on the side of the people? Are you on the side of justice? Are you on the side of the poor and the working class and marginalized communities? And when you ask yourself that fundamental question, are you with the oligarchy or are you with the people? That's when people start to realize, wow, I'm with the people. And that's where I see the real battle in America unfolding over the next decade. The real struggle is no longer liberal versus conservative. The real struggle is the people versus the machine, right? Or the people versus the oligarchy. Or the people against these two corporate parties that just want to work for their, wealthy donors and not work for the people. So if we can stay together and keep achieving solidarity, the future of the progressive movement is bright. And not only that, the future of the American people is bright, because, that is, we have to remember, like, that's what this is all about. This is about, the progressive movement is about taking power away from these, giant corporations and the billionaire class and giving power to the people. And if we can keep doing that, and finally giving an alternative to the status quo in Washington, the future of this country is bright. And, I am going to keep fighting for that.
All right, Ryan Knight, thank you so much for your time, and thank you for a very informative interview. I appreciate your time.
Thank you, Torrin, and keep up the great work.
All right, man. Thank you.